social mobility refers to the movement of an individual between various social strata. So it can refer to economic mobility, like changes in income or wealth, but it can also refer to changes in social class. And it matters to us because in leadership terms, we need to know what are the things that are making it easy or not for people to move into leadership positions, because they may be facing barriers that we don't know that they are. And it's highly dependent on existing social statuses. And many of us navigate these systems and we don't even realise that we're actually not all starting from the same place. So I suppose it's the inverse of our 9 grounds, is that we know what the grounds are, but social mobility is the kind of like oil that lubricates it up and down. So this morning's event, we're joined by 2 leaders in their own field to discuss their thoughts on how social mobility shows up in work and why it's important for us to recognise that it exists to ensure that we are finding and supporting the right candidates in leadership positions. So I am going to read their bios. I always insist on reading bios because we never do it in our sector. We never tell everybody how great we are. So to my right is Debbie Rooney, who is the CEO of the North Dublin Home Care, which is a leading not-for-profit organisation and social enterprise that's committed to delivering high-quality, person-centred home support services. And under her leadership, the organisation plays a vital role in supporting older people and vulnerable adults to live independently in their communities, which is a key factor in promoting dignity, equality and social inclusion. Aside from that, Debbie's also a final year of a part-time PhD in DCU, and she's particularly interested in how home support services can act as a catalyst for empowerment for those in receipt of support and those providing it, many of whom are from diverse backgrounds. Hiya, Debbie. And Claire Dunne, to my left, works in higher education with a focus on access and inclusion for students from socio-economically underrepresented backgrounds. A graduate of TU Dublin through an Access entry route herself, she holds a degree in social care and a master's degree in non-profit leadership and management. Claire is passionate about breaking down barriers to opportunity and has dedicated 15 years to working in social care, youth work and education. From supporting children in care to working with homeless populations, her career has been grounded in social justice and community. So like super cash. And they're both fantastic, and I have worked with both of them very separately and in very different backgrounds, but I'm going to let them, I've told you what their professional status is, so I'm going to ask Debbie first. Could you begin by introducing yourself and give us a bit of a background about how you got to where you are today?
First of all, thank you for having me here today. You're very good. And thanks for everybody.
Can you hear okay?
Can you hear me okay? No? Is it on?
You just have to hold it very close to your mouth, yeah.
Expert over there. So first of all, thank you for having me here today, and to the wheel, and for everybody showing up to listen to what we have to say. Just to give a brief background for myself, I consider myself very similar to everybody else that I grew up with, because I am. I just advanced in a different way to most. If I look at where I came from, I'm from the inner city. I'm from East Wall, and love where I come from, and I'm very passionate about it. I suppose, like everybody else that I grew up with, by the age of 19 I was pregnant, 22 I was a single parent. One of the key things of that is that I had very poor literacy skills. So for me, I never really looked at, social mobility or what it could be. I'd never really understood it. But for me, my influencing factor at that time was that I had a child, and I didn't want that child to experience what I had experienced. So will I go on and talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, another bit. Yeah, perfect.
So kind of life-changing for me was at the age of 22, turning 23, I was in a cleaning job, which I loved. I've always loved every job I've had. It's never been something, and working is something that we've always done. I've worked since I was very small. I was probably unique to other families in the sense that cash was king. We needed money, and it didn't really matter. Well, sometimes it mattered to your parents where you got it from, but we got it. From a very early age, my father was a docker, and he would have brought home pallets, and we would have chopped them up as sticks, and we would have sold them out the door. Definitely my neighbours didn't do that, but we didn't have a problem with that. We knew if you contributed to some kind of work activity, you got the rewards of it. And then probably springing forward, When I was cleaning, I always prided myself on doing a good job. I always knew that if I did a good job or if I sold a good product or whatever it was, that people would come back looking for more. So I'm in that moment, young child, back in my mother's, trying to make ends meet, and I heard about a CE scheme. So I approached the person who was running the CE scheme at the time. That's probably another unique thing is I always thought, well, if I wanted it, I would go and get it. I never thought that I wasn't reared by anyone who told me things are going to land on your doorstep. We were always told, if you want it, go get it and do what you have to do to get it. And we're all kind of feisty as a family that way. So anyway, I go and I see the CE manager, and she gives me the opportunity to do a CE. The CE at the time was great because I was a single parent on lone parents at the time, and with the CE at the time you could keep your social welfare and do a job. That brought in about an extra, I think it was £60 or something at the time, but it was fabulous, it was brilliant. It was a bit of Mickey Mouse money. I could do things for me and do things for her, and everything was great. During that time as a CE worker, they had a kind of a loyalty where they would give you the opportunity to either do training or get driving lessons. I immediately thinking, oh, this would be great, get a bit of education and I'd be able to move on. So applied for a course, showed up at an adult learning centre, and didn't realise that I needed to be able to read and write properly to do the course, because I'd wagged my way all the way through. Before that, didn't think that was going to be an issue. When I got to that point then, and I realised in the course, having attended on my first day, that I actually did need to read and write, I ran. It's quite an emotional thing, even looking back.
I understand.
But I left, and thankfully, and I will give them a shout out, it's Dublin Adult Learning Centre. They came after me and sat with me, brought me back in and gave me a cup of tea. We loved a cup of tea. And I stayed on the course, and I couldn't conform to education. Mad, because I'm a PhD student, but at the time I couldn't, and I didn't understand how to take direction in a class. I didn't come from a positive education background, and they still didn't give up on me. They said, oh look, do this computer course while you're doing that, and we learn you how to learn to read and write on the computers. This was the most amazing thing that happened to me. One, because people were starting to believe in me and seeing that I had something to offer to society. My family was very supportive of it and very proud of me, and consistently said that. And then I was found in a situation where I was actually ahead of people. I was now learning to use computers that nobody else could use. For the first time in my life, I was actually in front of people. Then from that perspective, I just continued. Do you want to take over and move on? Or yeah, I could go on all day, and I don't want to do that.
And Debbie didn't think anybody'd want to hear her story, but yeah, there you go, right? But Claire is here as well, so we're just going to bring me back. So Claire, could you introduce yourself and give a little bit on how your background has brought, or how you've got to where you are today?
Yeah, so just to echo what Debbie was saying there, thanks everybody, and bear with us because we're both absolutely bricking it. And when we learned that we had to actually speak through a microphone, just makes it so much worse. So like, bear with us. I'd rather shout down the back of the room. I suppose for me, I grew up similarly to Debbie in the northeast inner city, so North Strand, originally from the flats, still in the flats, and grew up, you know, in an area that, like most disenfranchised areas, are areas that experience like underrepresentation or, you know, marginalisation, like all that comes with that and what you're exposed to. But for me, I was very lucky because I was growing up at a time where the likes of youth services and stuff were funded properly, you know, and had really great, amazing opportunities through youth services that, you know, a team of youth workers who really insisted that I would reach my full potential and were really rallying for me. Some of them are here, like some of the Swan Youth Service are here, so shout out to them. And it started with, you know, just someone approaching me and my friends in Leinster Avenue in Fairview. You know, we were hanging around doing what idle young people do, and two youth workers, Angie and Dave, like came up and started to casually chat to us. We didn't know that they were working from, you know, like a critical social education model, which is planting seeds, you know, and informally, you know, engaging it around things that impact your life, you know. But before I knew it, I was a raging feminist and at a Palestine protest at 18. Do you know what I mean? So it just happens that way. And that's the beauty of informal education and youth work, is that you're planting those seeds through relationships, and you're reaching people, you know, young people in ways that, you know, is different to outside of school. It's not formal. So I had started to go to the youth service then. So I moved from being engaged from detached youth work, or street work as we used to call it, but that kind of summons other thoughts sometimes. So detached youth work, and then started to go to the service. And before long, I was in the service 4 nights a week. I was there for groups that I was attending, but I was also running groups with other, you know, youth workers from that area. And we were down in, you know, Sheriff Street doing sex education groups with young girls. And so they seen leadership in me very early on and gave me a lot of coaching and a lot of time. And, you know, that's where my introduction to social care would have started. I wasn't really thinking about college, you know, I was thinking about work. Like Debbie's family, the value, like from dockers and stuff and tradesmen, the value was get out and earn your keep and start giving your ma a few bob. And we were giving our mas a few bob from, you know, the time of 16. If you're working 1 day a week and you had €50, 20 of that was going to your ma, you know, to run the cost of running a household. So the value was always on work. It was really the youth workers who were trying to say to me, but what if, you know, would you not like to do this work? And, you know, if you got yourself a qualification. So they were really, and I would have probably done my first CV in the youth service, and I probably would have done my CAO, you know, application in the youth service with a youth worker right by my side the whole time and following up with me and keeping me on track. I didn't have computer literacy at the time. We never had internet in the house, or a computer in the house, still don't. And, you know, so I had a place to go where that gap could be bridged. That would have been where I started to think about social care. And then later through school and all my education was a GESH education, the access team that I now manage, you know, the team would have been coming to my school, doing outreach initiatives, trying to get young people to have from inner city areas to kind of have that sense of belonging piece in institutions like TUW, DIT, Trinity and stuff like that. And so when I had seen that work, I was able to benefit from it. I went to college on an access entry route, a HEAR scheme. I didn't get the points to be there, you know, but I never needed any academic support. And so that kind of planted the seed. That kind of felt like youth work in education to me. So when I was a young person involved in that as a student leader, I was kind of like, I could use my social care skills here and all my community work in education in a different sector. So it was always in the back of my mind that I wanted to come back to that work. So that's kind of, it's a very full circle moment for me to be able to work in the access teams and work in widening participation, having been a direct, like, having benefited from those initiatives.
I love it. So, spoiler, I was actually working in TU Dublin when Claire arrived as an access student, full of the joys of life, and just wanted to get stuck into everything. So to see her at this end is like phenomenal. So for our particular stories, we're talking about social class, and it's so interesting hearing you describe what the social workers were doing, because you understand it now from the other side. But we talked about these moments where you realise things are not that, like, there are these unspoken rules. You had this really great situation in Canada where you realised class was important. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I suppose as a young person, I would have always experienced what anyone from any marginalised group experiences, is like that feeling othered and not really being able to name it. And when I describe it now, I say it's an elephant in the room that you sometimes don't know how to name, because before you study formally social policy or class, you don't know what it is, but it's a feeling, it's in the grey, which is very hard to describe. And I remember even as a young person winning or getting an opportunity to do a week in the Institute of Education for like Easter, and not being able to kind of actually get the benefits of it, because I sat there feeling so different to everybody else. Even though at first glance you think everyone is the same, it isn't. But so I didn't have the language at the time to understand that, and I hadn't yet had conversations with people who were more experienced to me that gave me the language to kind of put words to those feelings. And when I lived in Canada, I was working in a service. It was a residential home and school for teen mums. So pregnant, homeless young girls would come to the service and stay there for several years and get their education. So it was residential and education. And at that time, I had only ever really worked with people who looked like me. You know, I'm from town. All the services I've worked in were in town in Dublin. So I hadn't had the same exposure even to diversity in all its forms. But this service was very much a service that was serving young black women, and by black women as well, or people of colour and stuff like that. And there was lots of girls from the Caribbean. They were all Jamaican, so I had never worked. So I loved this culturally. It was a big learning for me. But so I was working with, like, say, 20 young people, and a lot of them, the majority at the time when I was working there, they were from the Caribbean and they were Jamaican girls. And if you looked at us together, we couldn't have been more different, you know. And to them, I might have looked so different for them. And a lot of these communities, like Native, Indigenous, Canadian young girls, would have been, you know, apprehended in their childhood by white social workers and stuff like that. So there's lots of stuff that would mean that we wouldn't connect, you know. And my manager was worried, and she was a woman of colour, and she was kind of saying, I didn't think you'd be able to connect with the young people so quick, because, like, you're one of the only white staff members, and also, like, it's just so, you're Irish and it's just so different. And working with the young people was so easy to me, like, and we really connected on a level. And, like, she asked me one day, she said, like, I don't mean to, you know, ask you this in a way that's offensive, but, like, are you from a working class? Would you identify as being, like, working class? And I was like, I'm sitting there, and she kind of is a very impressive lady, and she's quite regal, and I was a bit like, oh, I'm found out now, she knows, like, how did I know this? I thought I was on a blank slate and no one knew me here. Well, apparently this accent will tell people you're even if they don't know anyone else with that accent. So she was picking up on, like, what she was telling me was social markings of class. No one had ever said that term to me. She said, I'm trying to understand why it's so easy for you to work with young people, and I'm thinking it must be because you're connecting, you know, on a class background, or because you're all from similar backgrounds, and you're doing it with ease, you know. And I was like, I never thought about it. And I said, what do you mean, like, social marketing? She's like, how you dress, how you speak. She said, you use slang like nobody else. It's like, or colloquial language, you know. Like, I was always getting that written on my assignments in college, and I didn't know what it meant. Stop using colloquial language. I was like, why did you say it? Stop using slang. But yeah, just to summarise that, like, she was able to see, and she was able to talk to me about, like, you know, accent and cadence and, you know, the rhythm of your speech and things like that. And the young people are picking up on it, and you're able to speak patois, which is like Jamaican, it's their own language, and you can pick up on it. And how is that? And it was always a joke that Jamaicans also don't pronounce their THs. They pronounce them like these, the way I do. So she was like, it's something there, like, these are hearing that, these are, you know. So it was just an interesting conversation where I thought, you know, class had really come across even cultural divides, and you could feel like you were with kin, you know, you were with people from your own background.
Yeah, and Debbie, you had the opposite in your story, didn't you?
Yeah, I suppose for me, as I advanced and had education, moved into what I thought was a great job in the HSC and all the rest of it. It was only, and I was then doing a degree in social care. It was then that I realised that the class, and I could relate absolutely to what you said. When I worked with children, I could relate. But I found I couldn't relate to my peers, and they couldn't relate to me. And when I look back at it now, with an open mind, I can see they were probably jealous that I was relating so quick and getting more people to do more with me. But I was often exposed to inequalities within my peer group. Like, an example we spoke about was, like, self-harming is something that happens. It's awful, and it happens. And I'm the type of person, probably similar to yourself, I will address it, and I'll have real conversations, and I have no problems in that, because I think people want to have real conversations, and particularly when they're in a time of need. I observed a situation, and, you know, we have to look at services from a funding perspective and all of that, and, you know, as a CEO, I absolutely get that. But I don't get a class difference, and I don't get a socio-economic difference. I see us all as people, regardless of our role or status. In this particular situation, I had observed somebody who was, you know, putting Indian ink on them. I knew that was a cultural thing. It wasn't really. I was like, you know, we have to think of the risks and safety, AIDS, blah, 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 sharing needles, that kind of stuff. From a funder's perspective, it was seen more as, you know, abuse, neglect, mutilation. Like, I was like, no way, this is funding, you know, this is just a culture. We need to, you know, rise above this, you know, and if you're going to do it safe. So I did my reports and all the rest of it, and then I was, you know, called up on it, and I was told, when I stood up for the children, and when I stood up for what I believed in, I was told very openly, well, I don't come from a scumbag background that you do, so I'll never understand that. So, like, for me, it was just one of them moments where I thought, oh my God, I've evolved and I'm amazing and I'm doing all these right things. And yet I sit with my peers who do not want to be peers with me. So.
And that's one of the things, there was two things that you've both mentioned that I picked up on our story was the movers were the interventions, the active interventions, not sitting waiting for, you went and you approached your CE person, but you also, took up on the training, but that person came out and said, come back and have a cup of tea, and your youth worker took you back. And the second thing is the value of education. You are both hugely committed to education. It's something we see all of the time in the skills team. But what happens after you educate people? What happens when you get somebody that degree that they've been promised and there isn't the change around them? Could you speak to that?
I think it's deflating. Like, it's, we're all human. Even what I study now is person-centered care, and person-centeredness it's about, seeing each other in a relationship and, seeing people for what they are and what they bring to the table, and acknowledging everything in safe spaces, real truths, that kind of stuff. And, allowing people to be them in their moment, wherever that is. When you're in a situation where you're evolving, trying to, better yourself, trying to provide a better home, trying to, just do better, when people don't acknowledge that or don't, like, if I can just touch on one of the courses, another course that I did was one of the CAN courses.
Transformative leadership.
If you can do it, do it. Like, I have to say, poor Tony, I badgered him earlier about how he has to do it. It's just, there's two of them, the transformative leadership and then the leadership and change. One is an 8 and the other one is a level 9. I actually think both of them are a 9, if I'm honest. But the transformative leadership has helped me understand them situations. I carried that for a long time. And I carried it in a way that I would never do it to somebody else. And then I carried it as in, I'm never going to be... It's so lonely when you advance and you have no peers. When your peers are not your peers. And I think when I did the transformational leadership, I realised that that's about them. It's not about us, It's not about what we're doing. It's about their own insecurities. It's about her not getting her way that day and wanting to use me to get her way. And we spoke about this as well. I can also be like that. I've learned as a peer, within my peers, that sometimes people don't listen to me. One is probably because of the way we speak. I've been asked so many times, what's your education? Shame on you, because I will blow you away, because I've made every effort to be just as educated or more than the person that I sit beside, for the very reason that I've had to advance. And I have to have that as a background. And I know what I speak about and where I come from, and my truth is real to society. So if I need an education to get somebody to listen, I'm absolutely all for that. But the point I'm trying to make more than anything is that, like, you can advance in education, and I do believe in it. I absolutely believe in it. But I would say that the transformation leadership and the leadership for change, for me as somebody advancing, interacting with people who are peers, all that kind of stuff, is something that you need to do for yourself, because what that does is it gives you an understanding of who you are, why you are the way you are, why you react the way you are. It goes back to the insecurities that you had before. It goes back to the influencing factors that happened to you throughout your life. It shows you who's been good to you and who has not been. When I did that course, I stopped having toxicity around me. I stopped having people who, didn't allow us to be us, If you didn't have something good to do, or you didn't show up in a positive way, you weren't part of my life. It was transformational. It is transformational leadership.
Yeah. That course is one of those really interesting courses where it's super heart-centered. It focuses on you as a person, and you're lucky and fair play to you for having to do the work, but it's still, the systemic issues are still there as well. And you've spoken about that as well, that you're as educated as your peers, but there's still the othering. Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I think, education is often sold as this passport to, life-changing, mobility. And I think, sometimes I would love to do a study if I had the resources or time or funding to actually do some sort of a longitudinal study of like access students after their qualification, like their outcomes. You know, do they get on the property ladder? Like, you know, like even when you're invited to speak on something about social mobility, like I don't feel upwardly mobile. I'm not in a secure situation. I worry all the time about income and a permanent job, especially when you work in social care. I worry about like being out, which many young people in my generation do, and other generations like worried about trying to get, you know, a secure housing situation. And I always wonder, I'm like, what happens after education? Because some of the things that, you know, you don't learn about, you know, some of the things that are norms and values in your community will be at odds with you in a workspace, and that's not covered in any, it actually is covered a little bit in the NCI Leaders for Change course, but things like, one of the big things is like how you communicate. So, you know, like if you grow up in the inner city, everything is on the table. We're very good at healthy conflict. So like, or asserting ourselves and advocating. And sometimes, you know, you have to be very aware of how that comes across or how it's received. So I find that in the workplace for many years, like, something I'll have to continue to work on, it stays with me, is like, you know, how do you be your authentic self? How do you bring your authentic self to the table while also being worried about how you're perceived, or if you're only working in a space where no one else sounds like you and no one can relate to your background, which is often the case in a lot of sectors. So I think you're always straddling this dance and like this self-censorship piece that I sometimes talk about, that I know that even my students who are, you know, the first in their families to go on to education, like you're doing this self-censor, you're diluting yourself sometimes because you really want to fit in. And that was definitely something I related to as a young person, but it still holds me back even now. So I might have a seat at the table, like people might think I have a seat at the table. It'll be years before I ever confidently use my voice at it, you know. And when I do speak at a table, I often then am doing this emotional labour of like, was that all right? Was that too assertive? Was I too direct there? Because at home in the community, like if you have an issue with the neighbour or the neighbour's kid or whatever, you're going to call it out and you're going to sort it out there and then that day, and you're going to be very direct about it. And the next day you're going to say, you haven't got a pint of milk, have you? Because you know it's just the way it is. We tend to be way more direct communicators and a little bit more comfortable with struggle and being ready to, you know, not ready to fight, but haven't had to fight for everything that you had and haven't had to advocate for your child or your family. So I think sometimes that's one of the things that no one prepares you for, is that your communication style or your way of being will be at odds with other people at some tables and some rooms, and you'll have to navigate that sometimes without the language, but through great mentorship and having great managers. One is in the room at the back. Like all that informal, gorgeous coaching that when people take you under their wing, you know, and say to you, you know, you have to understand. And even like the CEO of Swan Youth Service now, I don't think she's here, but like, she would say to me, you have to remember that when people hear how you speak and the way you communicate, you're activating something in them and they might not even know why. And it's not what you're saying, it's how you're saying it. And it's just a different norm in their community. Some communities are sweep things under the rug and are conflict avoidant. That's not right or wrong, it's just the norm or how they were socialised. And sometimes that's all it is. And learning live in the moment to kind of check in with yourself and going, calm down, it's not a personal attack on either side. No need for defensiveness. We just have a different way of communicating. Does that answer your question, Sharon? Sorry.
Yeah, no, it does. It was trying to highlight how, like, the additional, like we there's a kind of a wide understanding of the invisible labour of women, of being parents and hiding your parents, and I'm obviously from a hugely privileged background, but it's the additional labour of, no
shame in that either, though.
No.
And there's not, like, we're not here today to say...
It's not a competition.
It's not and I think that's the whole thing, you know, that we don't have to sit beside sad stories, you know. Like, it's good to have a good story. We all want a good story in life, and I'm sorry for interrupting you, Sharon, but that's very passionate for me, because I see that in people all the time. They think because think because they've had a good, like, I had a good upbringing. I've had some stuff, diversities, adversities, all that kind of stuff. I've had all of that, but there's no shame in having a good life. I sometimes think that people think that, oh, you know, they'll come, oh, Debbie, you know more about that. No, you know more about that because you've had your lived life. Everybody's had a lived life. Yeah. So, sorry.
No, and that is, it's a wider conversation about allyship, and I think it is. I think there are a lot of good allies, but they don't know how to enter those spaces because there's an early, like, sorry, I don't want to speak on your behalf, but I want to know more and stuff. And I think, but you are right, it's not a competition to the bottom. Like, we all need to figure out what it is. I suppose what I did want to talk about is the invisible labour of all of those thinking, is this what they're saying? do I need it? Will I change my accent? Will I say, no, then I'm not authentic. Oh crap, which one? And you're like, it's all of that. On top of the fact that you're educated and you're trying to do work, and then feeling different from your peers. But also I know Sarah, one of our speakers before, talked about going home to her family who just working on the PhD is like a different planet to them. So she said she doesn't fit in with the peers in college, but then goes home and then isn't able to explain to the family what she's doing either. So I suppose...
You're doing good.
Thank you, I'm trying. But what I would say is, like, as people who work in organisations, rather than talking about the stories, what can we do? Like, what are ways that we can...
We can't change people overnight. We can't. But what we can do, and again, I'm going back to transformation leadership, and I didn't intend to do this today, but it is coming up a lot. But what that, and I'm right there with you, we have to be careful how we interact. I used to say, you're a liar, that didn't happen, that's not what you did. Now I don't do that anymore. Sometimes I say, tell me what that looks like. What was that? And then they can throw themselves under the bus. I don't have to do that for them. But like, when I did the transformation leadership, what I realised was I got some real good skills that I could say, be in that place. And when my peers don't trust me, they would do eventually, most of them, but in the initial stages, they don't. But I could definitely, and I don't want to use the word manipulate, but I have to use it because I don't know any other word that everybody will understand. But it's finding a way to get what needs to be done. Strategize, that's it. And by doing that, I don't care who says it was a great idea. I planted the seeds, I got it, and I made it happen. And that's what I see myself in my role as a change maker as such. But it was the transformation leadership that gave me an understanding of why, again, going back to that, why people behave the way they do, why I behave how I do. And then I could kind of transform myself to understand them more, to get what I needed done for the greater good.
What you're saying is really generous, but again, the onus was put on you to figure that out. My question would be, what can other people do? What can the systems do? What can the workplaces do?
So if I can say, even in my workplace,
Go.
I know what it's like. So I know what it's like to have nothing, but you have everything. You know, like, I'm talking about a story, but I have had the best life. I'm full of love and joy and all the rest of it, but it doesn't pay the bills, you know? So when you want to advance, and I think from my perspective, so in our job we have, so I put together this system. Now I will say I say people say to me, oh, they work for you. Nobody works for me. We are all leaders in our own right. We are servant leaders. We serve a purpose. Absolutely. There's nobody, and I hate when we talk about statuses, and I hate the way when we talk about roles and you do a pyramid and and all the rest of it. It drives me mad. I absolutely believe that everybody commits and contributes to something for the greater good. In our job, we have a system that we use where people come off the live register, we pay for their training, and we send them on the training before they even come to the job. That's unique. But what I will say is, nobody did that for me. And if somebody would have done that for me, I would have advanced a lot quicker. But what happens is, and it's true, I would say probably about 90% of people who have come through that system, seeing that we as an organisation invested in them, believed in them, and then they stay with us, and then they show others, and they show up for others. And there's sometimes, regardless of where you are in your role, and I'm sure everybody will understand this, me as a boss or whatever, sometimes people come into my room and, we're talking about, people, carrying on, screaming, shouting, whatever. I'll say that's an unmet need. Somebody's not being heard. When they come into my room, I'll say, you have obviously got stuff going on. You don't need to tell me, but you need to take a time for yourself. And I would ask them to come to work and just show up. Because sometimes in life, that's all we can do. We never have to, I don't have to know what's going on for you in your life. But when I give you the opportunity to go off and look after what's important to you in your life and sort it out, when you come back into the role, you give 110% and more, and you're committed and you don't go. And Sharon, just when a lot of the non-for-profits talk about, but you invest all this money, this human capital, and then they go off. So what if they go off? If they go off and the impact on somebody else's life, and they continue the cycle of doing that, and and we continue to act as leaders and change and all the rest of it. Is that not okay? Is that not what the non-for-profits are all about? I don't want them going off.
No.
And your apprenticeship is another plug.
Yeah, the apprenticeship which we're all working on. But the idea, I think what I'm hearing you say is that start with trust, because there does seem to be a bit of, well, they have to work here for X amount of time before I consider investing in them. Whereas you're saying we invest in them in the hope that that is repaid.
It's remembering that it took a lot for that person to approach you in the first place.
Dr.
Don't underestimate that. That is a lot.
Yeah.
That is asking somebody to be very vulnerable and take a chance in life. Don't fail them on that, you know?
Yeah, Dr. Jennifer O'Kk spoke at one of our events a few months back, and we were talking about kindness, and we were talking about what could we do, and she pointed out that we are already asking so much of the people who have already, like, they're already behind, and we want them to volunteer to show that they're committed and that sort of thing. She's like, you know, start paying people and start treating them, like, giving them human agency first. Claire, what are ways you think organisations can support people who are experiencing social mobility issues?
It's a very big question. I think if you're talking about any equality issue or groups who experience marginalisation, it's always good to look at it in terms of intersectionality and recognising that, you know, there are many layers. So, you know, you've got we're talking about, you know, even women in work, you know, we're talking about the glass ceiling that people are trying to smash, and then you've got the class ceiling after the glass ceiling, and, you know, there's so many layers. And then if you add race or disability and stuff into that, so it's a very tricky thing. I think equity work involves a dislodging of privilege and affluence at the top, and people at the top being willing. Like you said, it's not our job. You know, it should be people at the top kind of going, this is an issue that we need to dislodge some of the privilege and opportunity, but no one's going to forfeit their privilege and opportunity. So that's for a much bigger conversation, but equity work requires positive discrimination and targeted responses that to some people look like you're taking from them. And this is to say, if you don't relate to, you know, what we're talking about today, doesn't mean that you haven't had, you know, extreme hardship, bereavement, or challenges in your life. It didn't mean you had it rosy. It just means that your life, what you navigated like everybody else, wasn't compounded by, you know, an insecure financial background, and the things that come with that, or growing up in an area that has, you know, many social issues. So sorry, I have a million things in my head that I'm trying to think of, so that's kind of bigger. But I think for me, and a really practical thing that we can do is look at where we are at first and go, you know, even informally, do a little audit of your organisation. So if you're a CEO or senior leader here, like, ask yourself, start with self first and kind of understand, do I have a deep enough understanding of these issues? You know, is today the first step in understanding that? Can you widen out that understanding to your team? Can you create psychologically safe work environments where your team member, if is from my background or a similar background, could come to you and express safely that there are barriers, even though you might be from different walks of life? To me, it's really small stuff that you could do. Like, I have had many managers and leaders, I've been very blessed and lucky, where they brought me to spaces that I didn't need to be in, but they brought me in for exposure. That's something so simple any of you could do this week. Is if you know you have a worker on your team who doesn't have the same networks as others, who might not have the same exposure, bring them. Not because they'll have anything to say there or need to be there, just bring them along for the exposure. And when you bring them there, maybe tell someone about something great that they did in their work that they won't say for themselves. Go, do you know what Claire's really good at? You know, facilitating space. You know, she's done something recently. You know, so find ways to champion people from different backgrounds in those spaces, because they will struggle a lot of time to do it for themselves. And I think it's all those small practical things like informal mentorship, you know, and also asking people, you know, putting it on the table and asking people, if this is something that you experience, I'd like to hear more about the challenges you face. I would say organisations, people are higher levels, you know, that I'm not used to it, but really do some sort of an analysis, or even an informal audit of, like, where are people sitting? You know, is the hierarchies and the structures in your organisation representative of the wider society? And if it's not, then you've got a blind spot. And it means you're overlooking people that are very talented. And it means you've got one type of talent and one type of view. If you've got an unconscious bias around classism and stuff like that, you're potentially losing great team members because you don't see them as a leader, because you haven't challenged, you know, it's that thing, that TED Talk, you know, the dangers of a single story. If you've got one view of who a leader is, and if he's a, you know, and even in social care and community sector, in the high jobs, usually in the CEO positions, it's usually a male. They're usually from a more affluent community, and then all the frontline practitioners sound like me, and all the frontline practitioners are from the inner city and are expected to solve the issues in their communities. That's something to question and to have a little bit of a deeper understanding for. Start with self. And when you understand self, widen it out on your team. Go back to your next team meeting and go, lads, I was at a very interesting conversation and something I couldn't relate to or did relate to or didn't talk about before. If this is something that impacts any of yous, I'd love to hear about it. And just lastly, Sharon, something that my previous manager reminded me of this morning, like great leaders, recognise that everyone is not a homogenous group. No one is a homogenous group. Everyone is so individual. And so to be a great leader is to recognise that each member on your team might have different needs, different, experiences, and that you should be tailoring your support to that, if you can. And that first starts by asking people, what do you need? Is there anything I could help you with? But I think a very simple thing that I would ask people to do, kind of like a call to action, is bring someone on your team who might not have the networks to something that they don't need to be at just because it's exposure.
Yeah, we one of the reasons this actually came up in my head was KPMG did a report. Obviously they're accountants, so they track absolutely everything and they realised that they had a really diverse kind of entry graduate programme because they had active participation in the universities to diversify. Big difference was getting people from entry level into middle management. If they got to middle management, they were progressing really quickly into senior management, but it was that jump, and a lot of that comes down to informal networks as well. So I would speak to leaders who say, I don't have a training budget, but I really want to, bring someone along. And I would say to them, have you heard about the Breakfast Club? Send them along, introduce them, we'll connect with them on LinkedIn. But there are free things to do that, like around mentoring, around coaching, asking someone on your team, I don't know anything about your background, we're very different, what is different about you. So last word to you, Debbie, what would you say to leaders in the space to maybe have a think to?
One, I think we're all leaders, and I have to stress that. I don't think there's any, and I will always say that every day. And it's a problem I see that when people do advance, and really sadly that when, social mobility does take place, the very people who are mobile, socially mobile, and they seem to, some of them can become very toxic and start behaving like the peers to fit in. So I'd say don't do that. Definitely remember who you are and what you stand for. But what I'd say for me, and what has always worked well for me, and what I'd encourage everybody else to do is don't surround yourself with yes people. It's not a good thing. Surround yourself with people who challenge you, who, surround yourself with people who know better than you. Not for everything, but for other things. Don't be afraid of it. If you need to look at yourself and protect yourself, you're not learning enough, you're not doing enough. In any form of leadership, I think it has to be, people have to challenge you. You have to challenge yourself. But when you are in a leadership role, challenge is not something that comes comfortable. You've just said it. You have to be open to challenge. And you have to see it as a productive thing to do greater good. That's mine.
I love it. Didn't that fly? And did they do great for two people who were bricking it? I really appreciated that whistle. That was excellent. So if you haven't been here before, we break now for about half an hour. There's tea, coffee, pastries, and we'd ask you to network exactly like we just discussed, and then we'll come back at about 10 to 12 to take some questions from you guys to both of the speakers. But I cannot thank them enough. It was a very vulnerable story for both of them, and they very kindly shared it with us, and I knew how important it would be. So round of applause for the ladies, and thank you so much.